So at 3:33 p.m., we will call this policy committee meeting to order. And the first item on our agenda is the recovery plan, correct?
Yes, Commissioner James Hassan, this is Jenny Wu. So
Welcome,
I will
Jenny.
be, thank you. So the presentation is actually loading right now. It takes a minute because there are some pictures in there. So while it's loading, I will start talking first while it's doing that. So we also provided a similar presentation to Operations Committee. We wanted to, as we've talked about before, continue to provide, as up-to-date updates as we can throughout this recovery planning process, knowing that it is a quickly shifting and iterating planning process that we are in. And so we wanted to make sure that at any committee meeting time, we provided kind of the most up-to-date information that we could regarding where we are in planning. And as a reminder, our plan is still currently to bring to the board at the next week's board meeting, July 28th, kind of our full reopening plan as a kind of more comprehensive update. But we wanted to come today to provide you with a little update on where we are right now, given the announcement yesterday, and then also to share a little bit about how the in-person summer school sites are going, just to give you a sense of how that is going and what we're learning from that. So, the first thing I will say here, as the PowerPoint continues to load, is I'm sure folks have seen the communications and the announcement yesterday regarding the all virtual start to the 2020-2021 school year. So I'm gonna kind of walk through that in 1 second as this is almost finished loading here. Give it 10 more seconds. And I believe, Christian, you have the document as well.
Yeah,
so
I was just about to post in the chat. It just
Yep.
uploaded to Board Docs.
Great.
So Jenny, then it's also available for the public to see on Board
Yes,
Docs, correct?
That
Excellent.
Is right. Okay, it's almost there.
So while Dr. Wu is loading this, Dr. Brooks or Ronald, do either of you have any questions on it, on anything you've seen before or pieces that we could maybe address while the presentation's loading?
So,
go ahead, Commissioner Brooks.
Yeah, so I was going to say, at our last meeting, our 3x3, I did not get a chance to see the specific health plan that would sort of go the response to a COVID-19 outbreak, and was wondering if we had that in place, and then who's our health, like if the district doesn't have a health commissioner within our district, like within the auspices of our institution, who's taking up the lead to track in real time potential outbreaks for COVID-19?
So I can start in terms of the document. I believe that the board does have access to that SOP document on operations that has that section that talks about if there is an outbreak. So
I think that was just sent to operations. It wasn't sent to the full board.
Okay.
Was that the summer school SOP?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I'll resend that to everybody.
Okay, great.
Okay.
So that document is a starting place. I think that in terms of the second part of your question, I think that outlines the process by which we would follow up on any sort of outbreak. We are still in partnering with the city health department on the process for that. I don't know if Jeremy wants to talk a little bit about that process of notification and then how that would work, or Allison.
Perfect. I can jump into if Jeremy's not here. Yeah, I mean, our partner is the health department on this. Our first point of contact is the local health department, the Baltimore City Health Department, and then they liaise with the state health department. If we have any, if there's a suspected case of COVID, the protocol is that individuals call the human capital office, so they call Jeremy. Then, if we have a positive test, we put in place, various protocols. So we do work on figuring out who was at the space with that person who may have been exposed, and anybody, both the individual who tested positive as well as the people they had contact with are self-quarantined for 14 days. Our leave policy has paid leave for individuals in that circumstance that does not come out of either their sick leave or their vacation leave. It's leave specifically for that purpose, as was created in the CARES Act. And then, going forward, the standard operating procedures in the summer school were also reviewed by the health department. So they helped us review those and make changes to them to meet their needs. And we'll continue to be a partner going forward. We also have a health advisory group of local epidemiologists who also are advising us on the hybrid model and how to cohort students to keep them safe, and to also limit the exposure between individuals if in a hybrid model.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Allison. And once I get a chance to look at that, I'll sort of propose any additional questions and sort of send them to Christian so we could get any additional questions answered.
Great.
Thank you,
Commissioner.
Thanks, Commissioner. So the quick overview here in terms of the announcement that was made yesterday is we really came to this decision that Dr. Santelises announced yesterday after a lot of focus planning, as well as getting feedback from various stakeholder groups through various means like polls, virtual town halls, surveys. And then we also took into consideration the current progression of what's going on with the virus here in Baltimore and Maryland. And so with that, the decision here was to start all virtual for the beginning of the school year. And then as we go through the fall, we would add in this option to transition for people who were interested into the hybrid model, where there is some mix of in-person instruction as well as the virtual option. So for people who were still not comfortable with any of that in-person component, the all virtual option would continue. So this is not a transition into hybrid that everybody would transition. There would still be the option that would remain for people who still wanted to remain all virtual. So by making this announcement yesterday, it really helps us to really focus on having a more robust implementation of a really high quality all virtual model. So we can make sure that staff are planning for that very robustly right now, as well as ensuring that the professional development that we are planning to have at the beginning of the school year for our school-based staff and teachers is really focused on that particular model. We know from our surveys and polls and town halls that our teachers really wanted additional opportunities for professional development around using technology, how to be effective in an all virtual kind of environment. So we wanted to make sure that we were able to provide that opportunity, which is also why there is the proposal that we are planning to put before the board next week around a change to the school calendar, which would shift the first day of school for students to be the day after Labor Day, which is September 8th, so that it would allow us to have 8 days of professional development for our 10-month school-based staff prior to the start of school for students. And we just really believe that that is what will help us to make sure that we can implement a high-quality virtual option at the start of the school year. We also just wanted to note that, the goal that we have here is still to be able to provide that hybrid learning option at some point as conditions allow, because we do believe that, we talked about the fact that many of our families and students indicated they wanted an option. They wanted a choice, all virtual or having some in person, and we want to make sure that we are able to do that. We know that there is additional planning that we need to do for that. And so this all virtual opening allows us to have a little bit more time to really thoughtfully and comprehensively plan for that at a broader scale for more students to be able to take advantage of that and families who are interested. At the same time, when we open all virtually, we will plan to look at prioritizing certain small groups of students for in-person instruction, even with that all virtual start, in ways similar to the fact that we have the in-person small programs of summer school right now. We would be looking to provide some of those options, even on a small scale at the beginning of the school year, even as the whole district is in an all virtual model, so that we can start to provide some of that in-person experience for some of our students who really might need that the most. And we would, as we are right now learning from the in-person summer school opportunities, to be able to translate that learning into how we would do that in the fall when the school year starts. The other opportunity this affords us is that as we start the school year, we will have the chance to really provide training and orientation for our staff, our students, and our families for that transition into the hybrid in a more comprehensive way than if we were trying to do that between now and the start of the school year. So it will allow us to have more time for that transition as well.
Jenny, can I jump in with a question?
Yes, absolutely.
Do we have an idea on a minimum amount of time runway we would give parents and families from going from virtual to hybrid?
Sure. I don't think we have. Yep. I don't know that we have a minimum amount of time. I think we know that that is not a flip of the switch kind of process or transition that we want families to have to make, nor I think could we make that switch that quickly internally. There are a lot of things around, adjusting, what students and what staff would be teaching in which way. So that would require a runway in order to implement that. And so that would take time for us to implement that. So it wouldn't be something that would happen on very short notice. We would make sure that we provided enough runway for staff and families to make that adjustment.
Okay, yeah, I
Dr.
think
Wu, I
that,
also
that
have a
might be
question.
really important moving forward to just make sure that families know, especially if they're leaning into grandparents or extended family on childcare to be, or if they're paying for childcare so that they can have sort of a month to month to know when to terminate that.
Yes.
I think would be really important to families. Somebody else wanted to comment?
Dr. Wu,
Yes.
yes, Commissioner Lynn here. Sorry, I had jumped in. You guys were already talking, so I didn't want to just bludge in. But for the hybrid model, I just had a question. So are we making it a mandatory thing for if we go into this permitting that COVID, numbers are down or whatever permits us to have a hybrid model? Are we making it a necessity, or is it going to be optional? I might have missed that if you already answered that question, but I just want to know, because to Commissioner Hassan's point, if we are going to, let them know, we need to let them know ahead of time. But also, if it's optional, can we allow our students to have the all virtual model throughout the entire year because of just the idea that, they may feel, unsafe to go into school buildings?
Sure. Commissioner Lynn, that's a great question. Yes, we would absolutely still offer the all virtual model for any families or students who are not comfortable with transitioning into any sort of in-person learning, right? I think one of the things that we have talked about, that has been very consistent in the feedback we've received from students and from families is that they really want to have an option, right? Of the all virtual or, to have in person. And so we want to make sure that we are doing that. And so when we, so on this slide that we tried to indicate that by saying that we're just adding the option, right, to transition to the hybrid model, meaning that would be an additional option, right, in addition to the all virtual option that students and families would still have at their disposal. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. So the next slide here just talks a little bit about the proposed timeline and calendar. So the top line here, which is the planning timeline, is that, as I mentioned previously, our plan is still to present to the board our reopening plan at next Tuesday's board meeting. Then from there, in the month of August, we would have very focused planning, especially at the school level, around what virtual learning will look like at the start of the school year, Chief Davis will be, and the ILEDs will be working, you know, very directly with school leaders as they start planning that out in a lot more detail for the return of their staff to start implementing the virtual learning. At the same time, right, knowing that we will want to offer this hybrid option later on, we will have to also continue planning for that hybrid learning option as well in August. But the focus at the school level certainly will be on the implementation of the virtual learning model, because that's what we're starting the school year with. In September, we would then begin implementation of that virtual learning model, continue planning for the hybrid, as well as I mentioned, providing opportunities for potentially small groups of students to start returning to have some in-person instruction in our school buildings. And then later on in the fall, we would then provide updates and next steps on adding the hybrid option for families as we are ramping up for that. And then on the bottom half of this slide is the proposed school calendar that we would put before the board next week for approval, which would be having our teachers and 10-month staff return on August 26th to start preparing for the school year. So between August 26th and September 4th, we would provide a lot of in-depth training and professional development for staff on virtual learning. So that is a total of 8 days of professional learning prior to students returning. That's an increase. If we had kept to the original calendar, it would have been only 5 days. So we wanted to add additional days for the training at the front end of the school year. And then our proposal would be for students to return on September 8th. And at that time, we would also be putting in place some different orientations and trainings for students and families as well, knowing, you know, we also heard from students as well as families around a need for some orientation and training around, you know, using technology, around making sure students can access all of the virtual learning that we want to provide. So we will want to make sure that we do that once school starts as well. And then again, later on in the fall, as we are considering the transition to adding the hybrid option, that we would then provide additional training and professional development for staff as well as for families to make that transition for those families who choose that particular option. I will pause here. The remaining few slides are specifically on the in-person summer school program that I am going to have Laura Ohanian talk a little bit about, just to provide a little bit of a glimpse of kind of what that is looking like, how that is going. You know, I think folks are interested to see kind of what some of the in-person programming looks like, and obviously it's something that we will build on and learn from for the fall as we start to offer that hybrid option. So I'll pause here for any questions on what I've discussed so far, and then I will turn it over to Laura to do that section of the presentation.
Commissioner McFadden? Ronald, did you have a question? I thought I saw your hand up. Maybe not.
You're muted.
Yeah.
You're muted, Commissioner McFadden.
There we go.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm muted,
can
and it
now.
seems
Thank you,
like
sir.
maybe someone else attempted to mute me, or unmute me. Either way, thank you for the presentation. Jenny, can you put the timeline back up on the screen, please?
Is it up on the screen for you? It's on my end.
It is for me.
So
It's up on my end.
Never mind. I must have pinned. Okay. Never mind. I have
Here we
it.
go. Okay.
Thanks. With the so with this training that's going to start happening in August, I'm assuming for the virtual learning, I know that there has been planning in general, you know, for virtual learning. Whatever our plan is going to be moving forward, I know that there has been planning with it. One voice that I have noticed to be quite absent from the discussion is the voice of our school leaders and our principals. And I know even and I mentioned this last week, in some of the survey data, it was like a very small percentage of our school leaders that were represented in some of the feedback that we've received. versus, everyone else. And I know that our school leaders and our principals are, they're the defender of our gates. So really this comment is more so advocacy on their end. I know that as a member of my own school's instructional leadership team and leadership team, I know that there has been all of this ambiguity and vague space in how schools are planning for the fall. What standards are we going to be looking at? I mean, just in general, just things in general. And I'm kind of disappointed in seeing from what this looks like. It looks like we're just kind of starting that work in August versus, things that have been happening since we've been away from school. So hopefully we can start to see just a little bit more, a little bit more on the planning end. I'm still gathering my thoughts around it, but I just think it's kind of late. It's kind of late to see it in August that happening. I know that there has been work happening, so it would just be nice to know some of that. When I think of our custodial staff and staff that's in the building, and I know you'll probably get into some of this as we start to go into the programs that have been open for the summer, and speaking to a few of those school leaders that have summer sites that are open for summer sites. I know that spaces were measured, and folks from, I believe, central office came into the schools to kind of work with measuring out space to see how many students can be in what space, which parts of the building. As we move forward in this discussion, I would like to know more of a long-term strategy and how we're planning to do that across the board. Also with, some of the summer learning sites, I'm still hearing some challenges that schools are having with engagement, making sure that students are actually coming to the spaces consistently. Even though they're in small numbers, I know that that is still a challenge. As we consider moving forward into a potential hybrid, and even just in the virtual space, I know that we've been having communication with our union partners on what work conditions will be like. I'm not sure if this is the space to discuss that, but when we start thinking about steps for moving our young people in the building, I think we also have to make sure that we balance that with the staff and our union partners and their comfort and their willingness to also be a part of this entire process. So I just wanted to raise that. I have a few more things. I don't want to take up any more time, but I just wanted to put that out before we move to the next part.
Sure. Thanks, Commissioner McFadden. I think to your first point around school leaders, I think that one, I will say that I think it is a point well taken around how much of the feedback from school leaders we have shared. Maybe more publicly because of kind of the way that they're embedded in the staff results, right? But I think that, and I know John Davis is not on the call in this meeting right now, but I know that he has been engaging with, the principals, and the ILEDs have been engaging with the principals throughout this entire process. A lot of times in very small focus groups to make sure that their feedback is really heard in a lot of detail around what their questions are, what their thinking is in terms of planning. And I know that a lot of them have been working, tirelessly over the last, month or two to start to surface a lot of the things that they feel like are challenges and things that we need to address. And so I know if John were here, Chief Davis, he would speak a lot to the ways that he has been trying to engage and keep principals in this planning process, because as you mentioned, they are very critical to this important work that we do. So I'm sure we could take that feedback and make sure that we provide some additional detail on the ways that we have been engaging with principals in this planning process. And also, I will say that this calendar doesn't share on here the additional professional development and leadership institute kinds of sessions that we will be having with school leaders, as well as their instructional leadership teams that are happening over the course of, have started happening in July and will continue to happen in August. So For example, I know that Chief Davis is planning to have the first part of his Leadership Institute with school principals and their instructional leadership team on August 4th and 5th. And they will start delving into a lot of the planning and details that they know that they will have to plan for when their staff return at the end of August. So those are things that are certainly in progress and things that we can definitely share more about for going forward.
I appreciate that, and it has to be raised more. I'm just going to say it again, like we just have to hear more from our school leaders that are actually in our school buildings on the ground doing the work. I'm also concerned about their mental health and their wellness and having to deal with this, and with there being so much ambiguity. I mean, at one point we're, telling principals to focus on hybrid planning, and then we are thinking now of starting virtually. It just puts them in this space where they, have to plan for so much, but with so much apprehension and so much ambiguity. And then finally, a big part of what teachers are asking for, at least assurance in knowing, are resources, right? Like, so what resources will teachers have? Will they be adequate resources? I know that is a big part of the conversation. I know that is going to be a part of the planning over the next few months in charting that out. But comfort in knowing what resources, the amount of resources, the accessibility of those resources, that's critical. And then finally, again, back to this education and this professional learning or this learning for all of us, parents have to be highlighted a little bit more in what we see. Like if I'm looking at this timeline and this calendar, I appreciate it, but I think we have to be a bit more thoughtful on how we are deliberately focusing on parent engagement and the training that parents are going to need in order to, and families, parents and families, in order to take care of their young people while we're in a virtual or a hybrid space. Because this is something, as we've learned from the past several months, parents were not equipped to have their children at home in remote learning in virtual spaces. And so we've got to make sure that we're taking care of those needs and in ultimate, with an ultimate focus of making sure our children are okay and that they're learning and growing. So I'm not going to take up any more time because I know we have to go, but those are just some of my thoughts initially when seeing this.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Commissioner Brooks, any comments, questions?
Yeah, so thank you, Dr. Wu, for the presentation. I have two questions, one particular about liability. So we have students in summer programming. What is, if any, liability do we have if that during the course of that time, COVID-19 is transmitted from one student to another student versus one student to another staff member? Is there any liability issues that we should be considering or thinking about in this moment?
I think I'm going to allow Chief Sivan to take that one.
Sure. Thank you for the question. I think that this is why, to follow up on some of the questions earlier, we are working so carefully and closely with health experts, both the City Health Department and our and other experts, to make sure we have good standard operating procedures in place. And then from there, the standard rules that apply to school district litigation will apply here, as board members have experienced in other litigation. So if someone sued us, they would have to show that we were not up to the standard of care for this, meaning that we weren't following guidance from health experts and the otherwise, just as in any other case. So the standard rules would apply.
Thank you. So essentially if the responsibility, then it sounds like it falls on the parents and families. So while we bring them back, we create the container, we do all of the social distancing, the hand sanitizing, and even if it does still occur in that space, so essentially a family would not be able to bring up any sort of complaints or file or sue the district because that we've done what we're supposed to in terms of the standard, but in terms of what's going on with their families, they still have COVID-19. So do we have any responsibility in that sense to make sure that they have access to healthcare and treatment, or how does that work out?
Anybody can sue us, of course. The question is whether they would ultimately follow up. And I can provide more details to the board, but we are responsible in the same way that we would be responsible when other instances happen in schools, to the extent to which it's our negligence that caused it. But if we are acting consistently with best practices and understanding, as we're careful to do, and Dr. Wu went on at length about the details of how we're carefully doing that, we are providing and maintaining and keeping our kids safe, and that's why we're prioritizing and stressing how to do this in a way that is safe, but also commensurate with our responsibilities to support learning for students as well.
Great. And so if, for example, we as a district we have put into all of the practices in place, does that cover the teacher as well? So if for perchance that, the students kind of do what they want to do in the physical space, that teacher is not liable for anything that happens in that space, correct?
Teachers are generally covered by the district. They could be held personally liable for intentional misconduct or gross negligence under the state law standards.
Okay, awesome, thank you. And for another piece of the plan, I know that there was a lot of talk and a lot of concern around how we're supporting our students who have developmental differently, or who might need have IEPs and all this other additional levels of support. If we could talk a little bit about both sort of what we have in mind for ensuring that they have the resources and the tools that they need, and then also, as I mentioned prior in a prior board meeting, how are we tracking abuse and issues that happen in the home that would usually get reported in schools, because we know that it's still happening. So where does that kind of to live in this, thinking about reopening and the virtual space and so forth?
In terms of your question, Commissioner Brooks, around students with special needs, I think Dr. Brooks, who is the Executive Director for Special Education, is not on the call now, but we can certainly ask her to follow up on that. And I anticipate I know that will be a part of the presentation next Tuesday for the board regarding reopening. So if not before next Tuesday, we can certainly respond to that question.
Great.
Great.
In terms of reporting,
follow up on that. Go ahead, Commissioner Brooks. Apologies.
Oh no, and I was just checking in terms of the reporting, right? So we're in a hybrid space in the fall. We know at that point we would have long-term been under sort of strict guidance and tightening restrictions for COVID-19. Also, it appears that folks may be also losing their unemployment, and so their particular COVID-19 relief for that, which creates a particularly sensitive and sometimes volatile context for our young people. So again, is there anybody on the phone who can speak to the ways in which we are planning to leverage our supports to make sure that we're able to document when students need things in this virtual space?
So, I mean, there's a variety of ways that we will be making sure we're connecting with students, both in the virtual space and in a hybrid space, with using the other positions we have in buildings to provide the kinds of support you're talking about. So we have community schools coordinators in 118 schools. So those are critical positions to try to provide access to key resources to schools. There are social workers in all of our schools, as well as counselors and school psychologists for students who need support. So all those positions are going to be really critical to weave together, a whole system of supports for students. Because you're right that both individual students are going to we have to be really cognizant of their social emotional needs and development, as well as their mental health needs, and then families need access to resources and programs and supports that are going to be changing through this period of time. So to your point, as family might be on unemployment with the extra resources from the federal government now and be okay, but then as some of the supports go away, it's going to be in a different situation. So we need the other positions in the building to kind of wrap around families and provide those kinds of supports.
Yeah, thank you, Allison. And I just can't say it enough that I think whatever plan we have around providing those additional wraparound supports, I think we're going to have to double up on it, honestly. And I'm just going to keep saying it because I think it's going to get really hard before it gets better. And I just want to make sure that all of our students are that they know that they still have someone to talk to and to reach out to during this particularly challenging time, and also that their families will have access to additional resources.
Yeah, we really agree with you on that. It's one of the reasons why we really believe in the hybrid model, because for a number of students, that in-person connection is going to be really important. So we're really trying to figure out ways to safely provide opportunities for students to have that connection to adults who care about them, because for a number of our students, that is going to be really important.
Great. Thank you, Allison.
And just to add on that, I think that same rationale is really important around the child abuse reporting function, really about students reaching out and also teachers having direct connections with students. There is a lot out there in the public about concerns on the front of that, and I think we need to also, and we will work with our teachers and staff to make sure and make clear that mandated reporting requirements continue into this virtual space. But again, that's why it's important for us to be thinking about a hybrid model as something that we're transitioning to along the way.
Yeah, thank you, Josh.
Great. So I have 3 follow-up questions on that line. One being, of the 118 schools that are community schools, how many of them have a hired an in-place community schools coordinator? Follow-up on that is, how many of those community schools coordinators were in place prior to going on COVID so that families and communities have a relationship with them? And then what are we doing for our schools that are not community schools to make sure there is a person that's the go-to person for reporting, for communicating, for social emotional support?
So first of all, it's all the schools that are concentrations of poverty in the under the Kerwin legislation that have community schools coordinators. I think it's 118. Just give me a little bit of grain of rice. It might be 119, but I think it's 118. I think I'm right about that number. And so all those have had community schools coordinators in place since last year when the legislation passed. So since about I think they all were in place by November of last year. Now, some of them could have left for some reason that I'm not aware of, but generally they have the people in place unless there's been some transition. There is a small group of schools that had been on a list that was surfacing for additional schools to fall under concentrations of poverty that wouldn't have their people in place yet, if that is the list that the state is using this year. But the ones that are concentrations of poverty, I mean, the reason that the legislation focused on that is that those are schools that have particularly high levels of poverty and need that support. But remember also last year, all of our schools have a social worker. So that was a support we put in place because we thought that was an important way to provide these kinds of services to students. And then, again, I think one thing we really have to make sure we're mapping out carefully is how are we utilizing all the resources in schools, all the adults in schools to provide these supports. A community school coordinator should be skilled at identifying the resources in an area to help families connect with services they need, and also, helping make sure that they know families' needs, and connecting them with those services. A social worker can do similar kind of work, as well as provide, some social emotional support for students. School psychologists can provide, mental health supports. There's also wholeness specialists in some schools that can help with some of the social emotional learning and development work we want to do, and create safe space for students to engage and with an adult who cares about them. So I think it's really about thinking about the combination of all the adults we have in a building that can provide those critical kinds of supports to students at a time like this that is stressful for everybody going through this.
Thanks. Allison, just can you clarify, because the Kerwin legislation that most people are familiar with was vetoed by the governor. So the Kerwin legislation that you're referring to is something different, correct?
It was the Bridge to Kerwin that provided the concentrations of poverty, and the lists that the state used to count the schools, or the poverty rate. The way they counted the poverty rate resulted in the list of, I believe it's 118 from last year, but there was a different list floating around that had a few more of our schools that, frankly, I have to go back and check in on where that landed, whether those other schools got incorporated or not.
Yeah, no problem. I just didn't want people to be confusing and thinking that Baltimore City thought that Kerwin went through.
Yeah.
Good. So then, yeah. So the next question then is about I just lost it. I just completely lost everything I was gonna ask on my questions related to the plan. And hopefully they'll come back, or they won't. I apologize. This is why I write things down at this age of my life.
No worries. Well, we do have more of the presentation about the summer school piece. So maybe, like, if we go forward a little bit, then it might give you a minute to remember, and then we can go back to your question.
Absolutely, absolutely. But before we go on, I want to make sure Commissioner Lynn, if he has any questions.
Yes. Thank you, Commissioner Hassan. So for the plan, there's an abundance of questions, but I think a lot of my other commissioners have answered them. But definitely, I would love to see the progress on the mandated reporters and how that's going to go as well, because I know a lot of the hybrid model has a lot of mixed emotions, but I think it's best for students in unforeseen circumstances. So for the hybrid model, let's keep in the mind that we're going to go foresee this in the fall. Are we, as the district, going to be mandating a certain amount of number of students that we're going to allow within the school? So in the hybrid model, and I think this could be explained to me a little bit more, because I'm a little ignorant on the factor, but with the hybrid model, just explaining a little bit more about the A day, B day, however we're going to handle this, and the amount of students that we're going to have on each day. And is there a certain amount of number between the Baltimore City Health Department and the CDC that we're going to be implementing within our schools, so that way we are, being within our required amount of people in the school building, but also within a particular space? And are we also going to be utilizing certain parts of the building? Because I know a conversation had been talked about around, using gymnasiums, using auditoriums. So are we going to be using those type of open spaces rather than the classrooms itself? I'll just stick with that question first.
So I can start, and then Allison can jump in if she wants to. So one, any return to school in the hybrid in-person model will, we will make sure that we follow all health and safety guidelines that are being provided, right, through our, the CDC, through our engagement with the city health department, the state health department. All of those SOPs, as we mentioned, for summer school were vetted and by those agencies to make sure that we're following all of those safety guidelines. So in terms of the return, right, students would be spaced out with the social distancing, with those procedures. In our initial look at the buildings, the A day, B day essentially would split in half, right, a student body at a particular school. And so because, as I think most folks know, our school buildings are all different sizes. Some of them are overcrowded, some of them are underutilized. And so we really do have to look at the buildings on a case-by-case basis to make sure that when we follow those health and safety guidelines, what does that then mean in terms of what space in that building we need to use? And then in situations where, and then also keep in mind, right, that we are still offering that all virtual option, right? So that means that there may be students who are assigned to a particular school who choose the all virtual option, which means that we wouldn't have to identify, right, the space in the building for them when the students who choose the hybrid in-person model return. And so we have to factor all of those things in, right, as we try and work through what then each particular classroom or each particular school is going to look like. But we, based on kind of high level analysis for the vast majority of our schools, we will be able to, on an A day, B day, right, even with almost all of the students choosing the hybrid model, which, as we've mentioned, that might not be the case, that we would be able to accommodate people following those social distancing guidelines and things like that. So that's kind of where we are. We have to kind of, as we move toward implementation of that hybrid model, that is a lot of the planning that's going to have to happen at a school by school basis to determine what that looks like in a particular school.
And Dr. Wu, could you kind of explain a little bit more? I mean, you said about the 6 feet apart, but also more so about the PPE measures that are going to be put in place. And then also that's another question I would like to extend on about, the funding for that. Is there a certain place that we're going to be getting this for to protect our students as well as our administrators and teachers as well? And so how are we going about with those type of protective measures for our teachers and students that will be inside of the building during that hybrid model?
Sure. So if you don't mind, Commissioner Lin, I'm going to actually ask Laura to start the summer school presentation because I think that might answer some of your questions about what this looks like for students and staff in schools. And there's actually some pictures in here, so you can also see what that actually looks like in the in-person summer school programs right now as well. And then we can circle back to kind of your question about the cost and paying for that as well.
So prior to moving forward, Dr. Wu, the question that I had that I forgot because I spaced because I'm that person is around our guidance and following CDC regulations, recommendations. How can parents and families, is it the website they should follow? Because we know a lot of this is moving targets. So as we ask parents and families to be flexible with us, how will this information be communicated? And then secondly, what are our internal practices for things like contact tracing, for updating on staff and faculty who may have been exposed or who test positive, as well as students? And how are we formatting, collecting, and communicating that data?
Certainly for our families, we will make sure that we very clearly communicate that. We will certainly put things on the website. We will send things directly home for families to make sure they understand, the components of what this will look like in person in school buildings. I also want to say that part of what we want to be able to do is even provide families as we transition into offering that hybrid model opportunities to kind of even come into a building to kind of like see what it looks like in person right before we actually transition into the actual hybrid model, so people can actually see what it's like in terms of the arrival process, or in terms of masks, and in terms of what transitions will look like, and hand washing and all of those things. So part of this delay and starting with virtual provides us with an opportunity to be able to do that across more of our schools and more communities, so families can actually have that experience of what that will feel like and look like actually on the ground. So that will be one of the ways that we are also communicating that and sharing that with families. And in terms of some of those internal practices, I know some of that is covered in the SOP documents. And then in terms of the contact tracing and those things we're currently, working with the city health department on a lot of those kinds of processes. So that's how we will be tracking those things internally.
Okay, and then one last question before I go back. Commissioner Lin has his hand up, but is around how are we going to, when we're doing the remote learning, capture attendance participation, and how does that affect things like enrollment caps? If we don't have seats in schools to fill, are we going to allow schools to open up and have more students attending virtually?
So the attendance proposal will be a part of the presentation next Tuesday for the board around our planning. I don't anticipate any changes to kind of the way that we are running enrollment virtually, but it's still a process that's happening where students are actually going to be enrolled at their particular school and tracked that way by attendance and for enrollment purposes in terms of how many students are at each school. So that is not changing.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Lynn?
Sorry, no, I don't have a question. I just I didn't
okay.
lower my hand.
I just saw your hand up. And yep, I just didn't want to miss you. All right, so transitioning over to Ms. Ohanian, yes?
Yes. Laura, do you want to jump in here?
Sorry, I forgot to unmute. Hi,
No worries.
Laura Ohanian, Director of Differentiated Learning. So let me start by talking about the development of the Summer Learning Health and Safety Standard Operating Procedures, or SOP. I want to begin by saying I have the privilege of presenting this slide, but most of the work that went into this was Sharika Bolden and Cleo Hirsch and Monique Roma in collaboration with the Maryland Department of Health, Baltimore City Department of Health, and a consortium of public health experts from local universities. However, each week we have met twice a week as leads to discuss the health and safety protocols, to be trained on them, and then as we're implementing them in our summer programs, looking at them in real time and making some key shifts as needed, or bringing up other protocols that might need to be in place. So let me give you some key highlights that are included in this 44-page document, in case you haven't had time to read through the whole thing. The health screening happens for every person who enters the building, adult or student, at Fort Worthington, where I operate as one of the leads. We give everybody a sticker so the kids know when they get a sticker, they've screened through and they see when the adults too. We limit building access, so we only have staff in the buildings that need to be in the buildings. We actually also limit classroom access. So if there's no need for an adult to be in a specific classroom and can do observations and support from the doorway, we do that. We've increased hand washing. This happens after the health screening and the temperature screening happens immediately as part of the intake, and then about every hour we infuse hand washing protocols. We give the students breaks, which I'll talk about in a second. All staff and students wear face coverings. We have backup disposable masks for students. We also have face shields that we use during health screening and at mealtimes for the staff. The students are in very small cohorts with students and adults. In the classroom, as Commissioner McFadden already eloquently pointed out, are set up and marked so that the desks and the teacher space is all marked out. This was done ahead of time with between 6 or 7 feet between each of the students and the adults. You also have those markers in the hallway and at entry and exit points. There's also an abundance of signage throughout the schools to remind students and staff about the protocols. If you could go to the next slide. So here you can see some pictures of the in-person summer programming. On the top left is one of our K2 rooms. You'll see that the students are spaced out about 6 feet between each student. And you notice the little small boxes. You'll also notice them in the picture below. Each of those boxes is the student supplies. They don't share supplies, and we disinfect the supplies at the end of each day with a special spray that is that will kill COVID virus. It's a protocol for spraying it. We have to spray it, leave it wet for 5 minutes, and then allow it to air dry. In the bottom left, you'll see some of the entry protocols as they're entering the classroom. In the middle, you'll see one of our instructors, and she's obviously doing a math lesson, and she's also wearing a mask and 6 feet from the students. In the top right, you'll see an exit protocol, and in the bottom right, another K2 classroom, and you'll see the teacher, the students, and again, they have their 6 feet apart, and they have their own space and their own supplies. All right. If you want to go to the, so the SOP is we're following sort of a continuous improvement process where we continually look at our protocols. We meet twice a week as a leadership team. So all of the principals and leads that are involved, we talk about what we're experiencing. We relate it back to the summer SOP. And we make adjustments as needed. We send questions to the health professionals. We've actually met with the health professionals as a group and asked questions that we might have. And this is all in an effort to make sure that we're preparing and learning for a future hybrid model. And that's it, if there's any questions about that.
Anyone have any questions?
Thank you, Laura. Yes, I do, Dr. James. How were the students selected? Did we target specific students for this in-person programming, or was it just at will?
That's a really great question, Commissioner McFadden. We targeted students that we felt were most impacted by the virtual learning. So we looked at engagement. So what we did was we took the tracker information, we took gradebook information, we brought it all together, and each of the school leaders and for our district program, we looked at each of the schools, and then we started to rank the students based on engagement and started offering them the opportunity first. To your point, when you brought up attendance, which I didn't answer yet, but I didn't forget, because we targeted some of our neediest kids, we of course do have some attendance issues, I think, associated, but we've targeted the kids that needed this the most. So we do daily calls if a student doesn't show up. And that's actually part of our standard operating protocols to make sure we know why students are not in and make sure we're following up, because we need to also make sure that we know what's happening in their homes and as we are in the middle of a pandemic. So we want to make sure we're following up. That's an important part of the standard operating protocol. And then we also opened it up, right? As we had seats, if other families were interested, and we would allow them to enroll because we wanted to fill our seats. So that's a great question.
So going back to what Dr. Brooks was mentioning earlier in regards to our students that receive special education services, our young people, I'm certain that they have access to those staff members and those resources during the summer also. Yeah,
so there are students who have ESY and they're in a virtual ESY program. So we don't have the ESY students because they were already in programming. But we do have students. We did invite students with disabilities that didn't have ESY service. We also had invited Esol students. So one of our sites has Esol, and we have an Esol teacher. It's also really important for us to have that so that we can start testing some of the protocols related to providing those specialized services and how we provide them.
Thanks. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Brooks, any questions?
No, my question was around how we were supporting our students who speak multiple languages and that sort of thing.
Awesome. Commissioner Lynn, any questions?
Nope, no question.
So my only question, Laura, would be around attendance.
Yep.
And how many of the kids that are enrolled are attending?
Yeah,
do we have any feedback from parents or families on what that experience has been like?
So I can tell you what we've gotten from families. The ones that come really love it. They're so happy for their kids. And the kids, I will say that I have considered a privilege to be one of the first people to be able to be with kids again. I was lucky enough to be able to be in this role. and to do this. And all of our teachers and leads were very excited to see students. And all of our joy was when the kids came running in the first day. We had to remind them to be 6 feet apart, but when they came running in the first day, it was pretty exciting. And they're happy every day when they come in. We have talked to the families. There's a number of things that happen. You know, this is summer programming, so they don't feel like it's mandatory to come every day. They know we're providing very specialized support. So if they're not doing it, we also made sure every student had a computer and a hotspot within the first couple of days. So because we targeted our students, the most of them didn't have that at home. So we made sure they had that just in case, you know, we needed to go virtual, but a lot of them have that access at home that they can do some of these lessons that we have. They're available to do that. So I don't have exact attendance numbers because it varies by site, and we have 6 different sites. But in general, the kids who are coming and the families who are coming have given us really positive feedback.
Yeah, no, and I didn't anticipate that you'd have exact numbers, so that wasn't a put you on the spot.
Okay.
It's more of are most kids showing up? Are some kids showing up? Are we struggling? Are we going through neighborhoods going, where are you?
Yeah, well, I would say we are getting some of the kids to show up. But we also had smaller numbers to begin with on purpose, right? So you can see in some of these classrooms, there's about 6 to 8 in a class. And we deliberately did that. So it's really hard to say when you have 6 to 8, if one kid is absent, it feels like a lot, right? So there's that dynamic too. So it's a little hard for me to.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it's harder, but we contact the kids every single day, and they explain, and most of them will come back the next day. We might lose another, you know, and then they come back. So it's in general, we see the kids regularly. It's just a matter of, because the classes are so small, when you have 1 or 2 absent, it feels like a lot.
And then my last question on this is, were there any sort of pre-assessments that were given at the beginning of the summer experience? And if so, did they indicate any learning loss from the last 3 months, or are kids staying on track, or do we know where they are?
Yeah, when we targeted the group, we looked at for students who were 2 or more years behind to begin with on the previous assessments. We actually are giving everybody a screener. We gave it within the first week, and they're targeting instruction. I can't tell you just like clearly that these kids have lost time, but I would say, you know, because I don't have all that data in front of me yet. But I will say that we targeted students that were already 2 or more years behind in this group. So a lot of those students were already behind, so it's a little hard to tell what was the impact of the pandemic. But I will tell you, a lot of them were not doing some of the virtual learning because we targeted the kids who weren't doing the virtual learning. Do you know what I mean? So it's a little hard to answer that question because we purposely picked the students who would be most impacted.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Dr. James.
Yeah, go ahead, Commissioner McFadden.
Laura or Jenny, I'm not sure who can answer, but you just mentioned something about devices, Laura, and I put a question in the chat a little while ago. I don't know if anyone had a chance to look at it, but it is in regards to students being issued devices and having access. So I'm curious to know, as we're thinking about moving virtually and a potential hybrid, students will still need, operating devices and internet access. Where are we with ensuring that our young people have those devices? What is our strategy currently in ensuring that our young people have devices, have connectivity, accessibility, especially now during the summer learning, but also once we begin in September?
Yeah, I can speak to summer learning if that's okay, and then I'll let others talk about the larger. If that's okay, Jenny.
Yeah.
Yep. Go ahead.
So for all of our programs, both our virtual and our in-person, we did outreach to ensure that and made sure that so we asked our families, do you need devices in all of our applications? And we targeted those families and we provided them dates where we distributed devices to them. And we made sure that they all had devices so that even for our virtual programs, devices weren't an obstacle. For our in-person, we knew, because we had targeted some of our neediest kids, that we would need devices for just about every one of them, and hotspots, because a lot of them had originally identified that it was a technology barrier was part of their need. So we made sure that each of those sites, so on the first couple of days of school, those students were issued devices for the in-person programs, and that was at all of our sites.
And we will continue to ensure our students have the devices and internet access they need for the fall. So I know we've talked about this before. In the spring, we did 2 different rounds of device distribution at individual schools. Over the summer, we have actually had that device distribution available at North Avenue, and we've just expanded the time that's available from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. for students to, or families to come pick up devices if they do need a device going into the fall, and we'll continue to have that, as well as working with our school leaders and schools to continue to identify students who need devices. We know with, as this pandemic continues and people's, economic situations continue to shift, that there might be families who previously did not need a device and now will need a device. So we're going to continue to make sure that we are trying to identify the families and students who do need devices and providing them with devices. We also have, as you know from a previous board vote, purchased 10,000 hotspots from T-Mobile and have been issuing those for students as well, again, in preparation for the fall, to ensure that students have broadband access in order to get online, to access the virtual learning, and have the ability to continue to, purchase additional hotspots if we need to for students who need that. Yep.
So great. Are we
just one quick clarification? I didn't think so the times were open from 10 to 6 is just Tuesdays and Thursdays. So if you said that, Jenny, I apologize.
Sorry,
I didn't
Tuesdays and Thursdays. Yep.
But it's just Tuesdays and Thursdays. And then the hotspots is one strategy. We also have other internet strategies too. So we're still working with families to encourage them to participate in the Comcast Internet Essentials, which gives the first 2 months of free internet access, and then after that it's $9.99 a month. And then we also have the mesh networks piece, as well as the state has money within the CARES grant to where they're going to support some support for internet in Baltimore. So we are looking to work with other partners too to make sure that there is internet access available to anybody who needs it.
Allison, I appreciate that, because, I certainly believe that this has to be a collaborative effort across all of our agencies in the city. And the responsibility of making sure that our children are well cannot solely fall on the school system. It has to be a collaborative approach. So I appreciate that. I want to know 2 things, though, in regards to this. How are we tracking students and families that have devices or don't have them? I know it might seem like a daunting task, but I think it would be helpful if we could get some sort of concrete number. 100% of our students have devices and have access to internet, or maybe 80%. We're on our way there. And then I also think about families that are unable to, thinking about MTA, thinking about the craziness, thinking about the amount of folks that use the MTA in our city and in our communities. Some people are saying that it is a challenge to go to North Avenue to pick up devices and hotspots. So are there other options? I know that you said we're working on it, but this is something that I'm hearing more frequently now than I have. People are having a challenge with getting to North Avenue for the devices and things of that nature. So those 2 things I'd be interested in knowing about.
Yeah, so we are trying to, we want to make sure that any student who needs a device has a device. So we are also adding, and I don't think this has started yet, but we're going to be adding Dunbar High School as another distribution site so that there's more sites around the city. We have talked about, the potential for mailing devices. We do have challenges sometimes with addresses, but certainly if you know of, one thing we've talked about is doing that. So if you have particular people who have expressed that interest in you, you could certainly, the concern about getting here to you, certainly forward them to us, and we could try to work with them to figure out how to get devices to them. But that is something we've talked about. As Jenny mentioned, we're really, through the rest of the summer, going to focus on the schools where We know that the number of devices that they gave out, the percentage of students that received a device just seems low, to try to figure out like where are the other families at those schools that we could be getting devices to. And then, in the early days of schools, potentially having devices at schools too, so that if families want to come by schools to get them. So we're really trying to make sure that for every way possible that we can get devices in the hands of any students who need them. And as Jenny said, that will change. I mean, there may be families who initially were okay, that they thought that they had either internet or a device, but just their financial circumstances are changing with this pandemic, as Commissioner Brooks mentioned earlier.
Great. Was that the end of your questions for now?
They were, but I thought I saw Commissioner Lynn's hand.
Yep, that's what I was just going to do. Is Commissioner Lynn?
Yes. So going piggybacking off of what Commissioner McFadden was saying about the laptops, what I have been hearing from students, and this is more so of more of a high school broad aspect, is that a lot of my uprising seniors are having a problem with accessing the internet and accessing their Google Classrooms and stuff like that, because as we all know here, the college process starts even before the school year starts. So it's kind of imperative that students are able to get online and are able to, check their Google Classrooms and connect with their advisors, their college advisors, on certain things as well. So I was wondering if you guys could speak on why is it such a limited access right now on these devices that we are handing out. And specifically, if you guys could target more so of the high school students, where the college process starts in sophomore, junior year, and predominantly our uprising seniors are having an issue with trying to, contact their advisors, getting on the Google Meets, because I know a lot of high schools have a lot of boot camps during the summertime for college acceptance, and because I know as we all know, the college process is very strenuous, so any help is definitely needed, especially during a time like this. So I was wondering, one, why is it so limited access on the laptop? And then two, are we going to be expanding on the access within those laptops as well, during the school year?
So Commissioner Lynn, let me make sure I'm understanding. Is it an issue that they don't have the device, or is it an issue that they can't access internet?
No, they can't access they can access their certain things. So certain things are allowed, but on the laptop, when they're, trying to go to Google, or they're trying to go to their Google Classroom, it's saying that they have restricted access and they're not allowed to go through there. And it's been happening on multiple devices that have been given out. So I don't know if that's a technical issue, or is that a something stern put in place by the district where there's restricted access on these devices.
Well, there shouldn't be about Google Classroom, so that is a really good flag. So I don't know if there's anybody from ITD on the call. If Michael or Armsby is on the call, I don't see
anybody.
So that is a really good flag that we had not heard. So I appreciate you letting us know that, and then we will try to follow up with our IT team to find out what is happening. But it's Google Classrooms, you're saying that folks are having a hard time accessing via the Chromebooks.
Yeah, and then it's Google Classroom, but then it's like other accesses like Naviance as well, because I know a lot of high schools use that. And it's just, there's limited, they can access their Gmail, but when you try to go into the Google Classrooms, or via Google Meets or anything of that nature, it's saying that it's restricted access. So I just wanted to put that out there and see what had been jotted down on that, because a lot of people have been coming to me about that issue, and I just wanted to kind of bring that up tonight.
Okay, that's a really good flag. I will follow up to find out what that is about. So thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Any closing questions or comments before we move on to the next agenda item?
Commissioner James Hassan, I wanted to circle back very quickly to one of Commissioner Lynn's questions earlier about the how we are paying for some of the PPE and the cleaning supplies. So we have an application into FEMA to help us pay for those masks as well as cleaning supplies. We also have certain things that we've applied for through the CARES Act money that's helping us with like technology. So a lot of the things that we are talking about in order to implement both the all virtual as well as the hybrid models are coming from funding that we're receiving through FEMA or the CARES Act money.
Do we have a
Thank you, Dr.
contingency
Wood.
plan if we
Sorry.
don't get that funding from
Yeah,
FEMA?
that was my next question. Yeah, that was my next question.
Well, the expenditures have already been made. FEMA is a reimbursement program, so we've made those expenditures on the general fund, and then we are hoping to get them reimbursed. From past experience, sometimes the timing can take a little while, but I think we're hopeful that we will get reimbursed. We have heard nothing indicating there's a problem with getting reimbursed. It just may be a little bit of a lag in the timing of when it comes in.
And so is that in the 2019-20 school budget, or is that fiscal year 2021? Do we need to be worried about what might need to be cut if we are not reimbursed?
I mean, we are having to readjust our spending plans because, of course, many of the things that we thought we needed in this school year are a little that we maybe don't need, and then some of the things that we didn't expect to need, we do need. So we are continuing to review expenditures. We have a group that's set up, or finance is setting up a group to review any expenditure requests that are related to COVID, related to the 16 work streams. As they're identifying costs they have, this group of people will review those costs to make sure they're aligned with the current plan. And then also we've had a procurement group or a group going through contracts to look at those to see, to readjust contracts to make sure they fit the current needs, as well as to, may reduce the size of the contract if they're paying for services that no longer make sense in the current environment. So in all those ways, and then we're continuing to utilize any grants that we can. So we put most of the technology on either the CARES grant or the City Council funds. There's also a tutoring grant that we just submitted last Friday that's through the state that would provide a lot of the tutoring supports. We put a lot of the lost revenue expenses for the food services. We put that on the CARES grant. So we're trying to make sure that we're utilizing all available resources to pay for a lot of these expenses that we have that, of course, were not anticipated. And then adjusting expenses that we have.
Great, thank you. Anyone else on the board side have any comments or questions? Anybody else on staff side have any comments or questions, statements? All righty, well, thank you very much. This is a heavy load, and just want to express to the community that, this is clearly an evidence of the conscientiousness with which we're moving forward, and that this is all a moving target. We're seeing science as it's happening, which means there's some experiments, there's some redesigning as we go. So asking for patience and flexibility, knowing that the students' safety and staff safety and then education is the absolute priority. So thank you, everyone. Mr. Gant, because I'm on my phone, I can't see the agenda to see the next item, and I just have my notes. So could you let us know what the next item on the agenda is?
Yes, ACH nursing mothers.
Nursing mother, perfect. And that is being handled by whom today?
Like Dr. Fink.
Excellent.
Good afternoon. How are you today?
Well, welcome, Dr. Fink.
And James Torrance. James, you here?
I'm sorry, I was on mute. I am loading the presentation now.
Okay. You're going to give me a panic attack.
Sorry. Dr. Fink?
Okay, this is the policy being presented to the Board of School Commissioners. And we're looking for the policy committee, and we're anticipating being back in school where we can really implement this policy at some point, because obviously in virtual learning, we won't be implementing it. Next slide. Okay, the Baltimore City Board of Commissioners recognizes the importance and benefits of breastfeeding for both mothers and infants, and we are committed to supporting nursing mothers. This policy is both for employees and students, so we want them to know that whatever they need to have in order to make their child safe and supportive, we'll take care of. Okay.
Just to give you some background and definitions that we explicitly define breast milk as well as express milk. So we're aware and inclusive of the terminology, but also define our employees to be inclusive of all our employees, as well as we define what is lactation and also a lactation break. We also define non-exempt employee because under the federal law this right is only given to non-exempt employees. However, we expand it to our entire employee base. We also define nursing mothers. Right now, we're contemplating changing nursing mothers to nursing parent to be inclusive of non-binary language, but also for persons who are transitioning. And we also define clearly what school grounds are.
Consistent with state law, a person may breastfeed their infant in any public or private location on school grounds, and that we should provide a reasonable amount of break time and a space to express milk as frequently as needed by the nursing mother for up to 1 year following the birth of the child. We are aware that this is going to be mostly for people expressing milk. We don't expect people to bring their babies with them to school. Go ahead. Next slide. We are not required to compensate non-exempt employees who are nursing mothers for breaks. However, if we already provide breaks, a non-exempt employee uses that break time to express milk must be compensated in the same way that other employees. The FLSA's general requirement that the non-exempt employee be completely removed from duty or else the time must be compensated as work time applies. City Schools is going to provide space for nursing mothers that is shielded from view and free from intrusion by co-workers or the public in order to breastfeed their infant or express breast milk. The space provided may not be a bathroom, even though the bathroom is a private one. The space provided must be functional for expressing milk. If the space is not dedicated to such use, it must be available when needed, so that you could have a temporary space, but it has to be shielded from view, free from intrusion, and meet all the other requirements. To ensure consistency and access in the space designated, schools and departments may need to establish a schedule for the space based on the requests submitted to ensure nursing mothers can be accommodated. We're going to provide reasonable accommodations related to lactation breaks, which may include allowing missed assignments to be completed at home or extended deadlines. And a student missing school due to parenting needs is a lawful absence, which is a policy that we've already passed.
In terms of employee nursing mothers, we're making sure that every employee has access to having a lactation break. And because of our feedback from our focus group is that we're making sure that there's an interactive process for this, especially with the Office of Equal Opportunity and Title IX compliance, to make sure that mothers are getting the rights that are due to them, but also creates a neutral party in discussing what that break looks like. And we're also asking that employees submit a request prior to returning from their leave, as well as we're looking at making sure that there's spaces available for mothers if they want to nurse their child at city schools. But the other requirements that we make sure that the nursing mothers must provide their storage and cooling devices and supplies. Similar to employees, we also make that same requirement for our students. We will provide reasonable breaks, but also we are asking that EEO also help them with navigating that process as well and submitting a form prior to coming back. The thing is that we want to make sure that we make reasonable changes to class schedules. That way we understand that nursing and everything else related to it may not be on the schedule that the school is on. So we want to make sure that students have that same access. And we also want to make sure they have the same requirements that we have as our employees, but also have access to a private location. In terms of our facilities, we make sure that we explicitly spell out that there must be electrical outlet, a chair, a table for nursing mothers, and where possible that they have a door where it can be locked from the inside. We just want to make sure that there is privacy and we understand the delicate nature of actual lactation, and that there is a designated space, and that this designated space is not solely for lactation. We understand that it may not. So for some schools, it may be the nursing suite that they may be able to use it, and this fit all this criteria. Also, we want to make sure that the departments and schools maintain a schedule so that we know that if there is something happening with more than one, if the capacity of the room is 3 people and there are 4 people requesting this, we can figure out with our mothers how to accommodate them all in that process. In terms of reasonableness, we try to take in the space of the facility, as well as how does the mother have access to retrieve the things that she needs for lactation, the pump efficiency. These are conversations that we want to make sure happen, and conversations that happen between our employees and our students. And then for lactation requests, we're asking that they be at least submitted 10 days prior to mothers returning, because we understand that this is going to be an interactive process and that there will eventually be modifications needed because of the actual timing of lactation, understanding that this will change as the infant or child develops. And from that, we have our engagement slide where we have senior leadership, responsible offices. So we talked with Human Capital, the Office of Legal Counsel about this, but also we had a focus group of actual nursing mothers in the district. We're going to try to figure a way to actually get to student nursing mothers, and then also go to our advisory council that discusses the policy as well.
Any questions from board colleagues?
Yep, I have a few.
Excellent.
Thank you, Torrance and Dr. Fink. Are students allowed to bring their children to school with them? I don't know if there is a policy that says that or no. I'm curious. It's a question.
In some schools, there is a daycare facility that is set up, but ordinarily, if the daycare is not set up, the students do not bring their children to school. We do have provisions within our policy to allow students to be getting home and hospital services while they have to be home to take care of their children, but we do not have children coming to school.
Right, home and hospital. Thank you for that. Does the 10-day business window apply to students for lactation requests? It's on slide 13.
Yes, because students will be out of school at that postpartum period, and they should be letting the school know when they're planning to come back. They do have the opportunity. One of the services, again, provided by Home and Hospital, is that students have the ability to be followed with all of their work for the week after delivery, so that they know when they're planning on coming back, and at that particular time they should give notification.
Could everybody mute unless you're Dr. Fink for a moment?
Great. The reason why I asked that question, Dr. Fink, was because when we think of business days, I think of staff. When I think of school days, I think of students. So can we explicitly reference 10 school days for students? Because I think it is very general in the draft right now, which just says that 10-day window for students to apply for that lactation request, or teachers, but it's business days. And I think the policy should explicitly list school days also, so that so that students and families are clear. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. We can work at that. It's not something that would be difficult. The only time that might be an issue is if a student is coming back after summer vacation, or if a student is coming back after a Christmas break or something like that. And in that case, we would like that 10 days notification, and maybe not 10 school days, because there wouldn't have been that. We wouldn't want a student to not be able to get back to school right at the beginning of the school year if they've been out during the summer.
Sure. It was just a thought that I had when I saw the language in the policy for those business days. For Form 2 in the regulation, the second form, can we include a digital version option with digital input capability and an electronic submission option? From what it looks like in the policy, there are several signatures that have to I think it's the parent, it is the the parent of the child, it is the school principal, and it's, you know, someone from HC or from central office. But is there an option to do it electronically? It just gives the information for where to mail the form or fax it, I think, but not digital. Is there a way to add that option?
I'm sure there is, but we hadn't considered it, so we would have to work together to put that together. At this particular time, all of us are getting really good at doing things digitally. So
yeah, so we would have. So I can work with communications and other offices to figure out the feasibility of the form and where to submit, how's it go, the workflow on the back end of it. So we can figure it out. We just have to figure out with our partners how to make it possible.
I appreciate that, James. I'm just thinking of the ease of access, right? If our goal is to make sure that young people are in our school buildings, I just want to make sure that the access is as easy as possible for them. In thinking about that, how involved were our school nurses that we already have in the development of the policy? When I saw the stakeholder groups, James, I heard you talk about you had a group with some parents, with some moms. But how involved were our school nurses in the development of this process? The policy doesn't speak much to the involvement of our school nurses or our school health staff. So I'm just curious to see how involved they were in the process, and then perhaps how involved will they be in handling and servicing our students that are moms. Or parents, our students that are parents.
So we have not had a lot of involvement with school nursing. We've run some of the thing by them, but the bottom line is that this is not a medical procedure. It's a natural procedure for women, and we didn't treat it as a medical procedure or something that needed medical support. It was something that we were doing to accommodate our mothers and to make sure that they were accommodated, and there was not going to be a medical clearance involved in that.
I appreciate that, but I still think that there should be some collaboration with school nurses. It may not be, to your point, a medical procedure, but I just think about the level of care that our school nurses and health professionals have in dealing with a myriad of situations. So I was just curious to know that and what their involvement potentially could be. Because in the event that maybe a mom is nursing or a parent is nursing and they come into some sort of trouble with maybe the device, the lactation device or whatever, they would still have to seek some sort of guidance from our school health staff, which is why I asked.
That's a good question. We will take that and talk to our nursing people.
And then a couple of more things. Section 2 in the policy,
Commissioner McFadden, can I jump in really quickly just because my question is pertinent to follow up to those?
Sure.
Perfect, thank you. So my foundational question is, why did we approach this as an opt-in versus an opt-out? Since as Dr. Fink says, this is a natural process. So everyone that gives birth, whether they raise their child or not, is going to need support to handle the biological consequences of giving birth and raising a child. So why would we not just simply say the lactation policy is everyone has access to this, and you set a timeline with your principal if you're a student or your supervisor if you're an employee upon return?
Well, not all people choose to breastfeed. That's one item. And so this would be applying for that segment of the mothers who decide that that's what they want to do. There are a lot of mothers who elect to come back, whether it's to work or to school, and their choice is not to pump milk and not to take these breaks. So that would be why it wouldn't be all inclusive, but certainly would be available to everybody if they wish to do that.
Yeah, why wouldn't we then just make it an opt-out for those folks? And frankly, their bodies may still need a break, whether they're actually lactating to feed a child or just to express, to bring their body systems back to sort of a pre-pregnant homeostasis.
Again, a good question and something that we will look into and putting into the policy. Certainly, we want it to be
I would think that would be
for everybody.
the more student-friendly and teacher-friendly way would be to assume that we're going to give you supports. If you don't need them, just let us know. but that's just me. So back to Commissioner McFadden. Go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. James. In the regulation, Section 2, letter A, number 3, in the regulation, it deals with public versus private spaces. Can I just get a little bit more clarity on the distinction between what a public space is versus a private space? I read through the language, but what makes a space private versus public?
So, Commissioner, I think, sorry. I think about, I have to look through this through the lens of like my wife. A private space is her choosing to maybe pump in her classroom. A public space may be choosing to pump in her classroom or nurse my son through a cover in the cafeteria or something like that. Whereas a private space is you have a room where you can lock the door. That's the only distinction I can come up with at the top of my head to make it easier to explain.
So if you go ahead.
Go ahead. So if a woman or a person who is a nursing parent wanted to come in and nurse their child in full view with a cover, they have the full right to do it. That's mainly what is making that distinction. If they wanted a room where they could privately do it, we provide that room.
Wow, okay, I see.
So on the converse of that, James, if they wanted to say nurse in the cafeteria while they were having lunch, their daycare provider brings the child to school, they could sit in the cafeteria and nurse. And there's nothing in the policy about needing covering, correct? Because we don't want to restrict anyone's rights.
Mm-hmm. So that's the thing. So I know I've seen women nurse without a cover, or they've turned themselves away from public. It is their right. I would not want to restrict anyone in their right on actually doing that.
But I hear that, and I also think of challenges that if a person is not, could we add language legally that recommends covering? Because I think about, I'm a teacher,
okay.
Right? I'm a teacher. I am in my school building. To Dr. James's point, if a mother wanted to nurse her, or if a parent wanted to nurse their child in, let's say, using that example, cafeteria space, where there are, just a bunch of children, I'm curious to know, could we recommend or suggest that a covering is that parents cover themselves? I understand it being their right, but I also am thinking about my children, who could, take this to another level.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think,
so
Commissioner McFadden, I don't think we can legislate it in policy. I think we can certainly teach about it in civility and kindness and caring for other people's experiences in your world, but I don't think it can be in policy.
Okay, so is there a way that we can, in the definitions, in the policy, is there a way that we can differentiate the difference between a public versus a private space?
I can certainly explore that, Commissioner.
Yeah, this is Sally Robinson in legal. So we'll follow up with James and Louise, Dr. Fink, we'll do some research and look into the idea of covering and whether or not that's something that we can include or not. So yeah, we'll have that for the next draft.
I appreciate that. And then finally, how will students be made aware of their right to request lactation breaks prior to their return? Is it something that will happen while students perhaps are on home and hospital? How explicit are we in making sure that they receive the information for their right to lactation breaks?
So students on home and hospital will be given that as part of what they have when they're in home and hospital. They are given a lot of things that, aside from their education, they're also put in touch with different kinds of services that are available to them. And then once this is a policy, we would provide that to them. Other than that, going back to your question about the nurses, we would have that available in the nurses suite and make sure that we get that to students before they come back to school.
I knew
As well as-
I knew school nurses could be utilized somehow in this.
Right. Touche. That was very good.
Yeah. Also,
wanna leave them
our
out of the loop.
social workers. Also, our social workers are interested in making sure that students that we may not interact traditionally through home and hospital are aware of this as well.
Thank you. That's it for me.
All right, Commissioner Lynn or Commissioner Brooks, any questions?
Yeah, so this is Commissioner Brooks. I think a number of my questions have been brought up by Commissioner McFadden, but I still was curious about when we're thinking about sort of coverings and that sort of thing. So is it not customary to do prior research before a policy is put forth to us around whether or not what's acceptable to put into what we're going to recommend for folks? It would have been my assumption that that's what we would have started what we're able to do before we saw something like this.
Yeah, so what we've done is so to give you an idea of like the research we've done, our legal department has looked at case law regarding the process in terms of what employers should do, as well as guidance from other school districts. The thing is, and some of the things I've never noticed is anything on covering. That's one of the things that we have to discuss and look into. We might have to do deeper research on there because even in some of the higher ed institutions, when I looked at their guidance on providing this accommodation to nursing parents, they said they didn't say anything about covering. So it's just like looking specifically into it. So this is one of those things where like it may not be a thing that's put in policy because of social norms.
Okay, great. And so also, I didn't hear, or when I was reading through the regulations, if you all could walk me through sort of how the space was going to be selected, and because I saw some language around like a space can be converted, like what does that process look like, and how do we make sure that the space that is sort of reconfigured potentially actually meets the standard for privacy?
So we've discussed this as into the school readiness process so that schools will identify a space in their school that actually meets the criteria that's specified in the policy. So do they have an outlet? Can the door be locked? We don't know the room number and all those things. We just want to make sure schools identify that potential location to us. And then if they have people, we'll know that they'll have a schedule already started. So that's how we're doing the accountability. That's why we're requiring them to give us the information. That way we know that there's a space that's identified and that we're telling them these are the requirements for the space.
And do we have any data, prior data around sort of parents who sort of breastfeed and utilization in the district already? Do we have a sense of what that is?
So we had this conversation with nursing mothers at central office. The conversation was some people had offices, some people didn't, and the access to the actual room, the discussion of how the schedule helped with mothers coordinating with each other as well as with the room access and the key. So a lot of these things came from just talking to mothers, like how do we process it out? So that's what we've been proactive doing.
Okay, great.
So sorry. And that's why we want to actually have conversations with nursing student mothers too, because we want to make sure we're being realistic to the experience of nursing mothers at the school level in terms of students and as well as teachers. So we had a few teachers who were there part of BTU in that conversation, but we just want to make sure that we get to a deeper level in terms of having those conversations at the school level.
Great. And I guess, so for just two things then, as again, I know you already mentioned it, as we're talking about language, persons, making sure that that is sort of expansive and inclusive of folks who don't identify as women but still breastfeed. So making sure that that's very clearly labeled in there. And then also when we're thinking about how we begin to track the data behind folks who are identifying maybe in the binary spectrum, that we're able to do that and have that data, and making sure that when the particular training around this policy is sort of rolled out, that the staff are prepared for those students. And so whether that's pre-work with the young people who are, or the people or the employees who are either talking to HR about coming back from maternity leave, or students that who are on home hospital service, that we're actually preparing the space for them to do that without question or shame, or anyone needing to be involved in that, and making sure they have a quality experience. So I want to pay good attention to the gender and the expansiveness of who we're seeing today in the world, and making sure that they have space to do that work, and to have dignity while they do it.
We share the same.
Go ahead.
I was going to say that we share the same perspective, because when we were finalizing prior to policy committee, we really started diving into changing the language to nursing parent. One of the things is that the statutes that we have say nursing mother or woman. Yep. So we're thinking that we just make reference to the statute, but also change the language to nursing parent and not assign a gender.
Yeah, so I think sort of whatever we do, because I know the district does not currently collect standardized data across for folks who are LGBT, et cetera. So I'm putting a request in as we continue to do this work and build this out, that we have a mechanism to capture those particularly important demographics, so that we'll be able to track how people are doing and moving and faring through our system. And so I think it's about the name and the wording change, but also making sure that the back end, that we're actually collecting the data that'll be most helpful for the district moving forward. And then also I have a really particular question around this notion of being 16, needing parental, like if you're less than 16, you need parental signature or consent. Sort of, could someone explain that to me, the rationale behind that? And whether or not that's actually legally required, or is that something that just kind of showed up in the policy recommendation?
Commissioner Brooks, that goes directly to my point of why this isn't an opt-out rather than an
opt-in. Sally, anyone else want to take it before I answer?
I don't have any information on that. That's another area that I'll have to look into.
Yeah. So one of the things that I have to look back at the district that use it, because I'm looking at I have to reference. I'll send a reference back out of an actual district that used 16 because they think about the age of consent in certain aspects for minors. So we added 16, but we can look deeper into it.
Well, yeah, because I mean, in our state, young people can go to Planned Parenthood and get services, I believe, at 12 or 13 years old, particularly if they feel that they, particularly around the context of HIV and sexual health, I think the age is much lower than that. So I'm not sure why we would have this process, which is deeply tied to sexual and reproductive health, with an age of 16, when the feds say that it can be younger than that.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions? Okay. Well, just to sort of keep us above the weeds on this, the law, as I understand it in my research, says that we have to provide a space. We can't mandate that students use that space, and we have to, and that it should be anyone who is in need. So thank you for your work on this. Thanks, commissioners, for your comments. Mr. Gant, what's the next item on the agenda?
Sorry, I'm unmuting. Gifted in advanced learning.
All right, and so I'm guessing this is going over to Laura. Laura, in the name of time, hopefully the commissioners we're all prepared and ready. So if we could just kind of hit the highlights on this one.
Yeah.
And if we have deep questions that we don't have time to answer, we can certainly take the time and or submit them in writing.
Sure. And just a reminder to the group that you've already seen this, but we had to, because there was sort of a delay due to the pandemic, restart this process. So this is the second time we're presenting to policy committee on the same policy. So I just want to be clear that it's going to be me, I'm Laura Hannon, Director of Differentiated Learning, and Dennis Trutrist will be presenting. And we'll go through very quickly and then open up to questions.
Lauren, this is Commissioner Brooks. Just quickly, has there been any changes since the last time we saw this presentation?
Yeah, I can actually, if you want, we can just go slide 10.
Okay, because I mean, because I read it. Yeah, so just to see.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Commissioner.
Yeah, let's go
thank
to
you
just
for bringing
really
us.
quickly.
Yeah.
Can you go to slide 9 really quickly, Dennis, and then I'll do 10, 11 fast. So slide 9, just so you know, we've had a number of stakeholders, and we've continued the stakeholder feedback since the last time we presented this data, which includes really some great support from our new Chief of Legal Counsel, and along with thousands really of parents, students, GAL leads, and teachers we shared with, not necessarily feedback, district and state leadership, community partners, school system leads, and engagement partners. This was shared broadly. We did receive feedback in different ways. And as we shared in the beginning, this is based on our learning from the past few years. So we've taken the feedback we've gotten on our protocols and practices to implement. So if you go to the next slide.
Two quick things though, and I'll go to the next slide anyway. But since the last time we presented to the policy committee, obviously we shared the minutes of the previous policy committee. It's on our outgoing email, so people can link to that and see the policy committee and get and provide feedback. And we've also had the opportunity we were peer reviewed by 5 surrounding districts, as is required by the state every 3 years. We volunteered to go first, and we received the highest marks possible. And we based it on all of the proposed policy and regulations. So we are in full compliance with COMAR regulations and expectations. Sorry.
Thank you, Dennis. So a couple of major changes. The policy committee wanted us to include ability assessment for students new to the district, so we added that language. Policy committee sought to qualify a statement for the definition on differentiation, which we updated. They asked us to express concern about CEO exempting schools from universal screening. This was made, the CEO exemption was made by legal department in alignment with COMAR, but it doesn't actually exempt universal screening, but rather allows for some schools to be exempted from the significant numbers. Legal team recommended some additions to definitions of compacting and telescoping. The policy committee wanted to include identification prior to kindergarten to better reflect our actual practice, so we added that. If you go to slide 11. Policy committee inquired about expanding the breadth of all students beyond what is explicitly named in COMAR. So we included gender identity and linguistic groups were added to the example groups in the purpose statement of the policy. And we added and come from all populations. Policy committee wanted us to make sure that honors and AP courses were open to all students who wanted to take them. And so omitted language was added to IHBB RA, so the regulation. Policy committee wanted us to include student process and outcome data in the annual reporting. That was added to the regulation. And legal required the inclusion of specific appeals processes, which is in reference to policy BLA and was added to the regulation. So if you go to the next slide, we can just open it up for questions.
Team, any questions?
No, I just want to just say thank you all for the, I think the work that has gone into this. And, you know, every time I sort of look at the presentation, it feels very robust and comprehensive. And I really appreciate sort of the work, even from the last time that we did this conversation, to making sure that we're really paying attention to the students who are not often served or reached in this. And I'm so appreciative that you all are expanding that definition so that we can always have more and more diverse students as represented in the gifted and talented program.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Commissioner McFadden, Lynn?
Yeah, I do. In our purpose statement, are we able to add students with disabilities to that, or students that receive special education services? Could that be added to the purpose statement in the policy? I know that
it actually is. I'm sorry. It is in the.
But thank you. From what I read, it's, and I might have just missed it, right? But in that first sentence, it says, coming from all populations, including but not limited to all racial, cultural, ethnic, gender identity, linguistic, and economic groups.
But then the next sentence goes on specifically called students who have been previously identified for specialized services. We wanted to call them out specially because of the twice exceptionality population.
Exceptionality. Thank you. No,
yep.
That was that's my, but thank you.
No, we're on the same page.
I appreciate
keeping us on it.
I was going to say, I was thinking to myself, that's a huge part of our vision.
Shame on us if we missed that, but we set it as a separate line.
No, yeah, it's the second sentence.
Yeah.
Do you want that, Commissioner McFadden, included in the first, or are you okay with the way it's written?
I think it's fine the way that it is.
Okay. It's so important to us. It's at the core of what we do, that and our ELs that are identified. And so I just want to make sure if it didn't pop for you that we can make it.
I think when we deal with exceptionality, I think it could be explicit. And then that next sentence just elaborates on that, if that makes sense.
Maybe we can say all racial, cultural, ethnic, gender, identity, linguistic, educational, and economic groups. Educational would capture ELs and special.
And you just elaborate in that, and the next, okay, great. How are we, and this might have been something that we discussed before, but how are we measuring achievement in areas outside of the listed tested areas, right? We primarily focus on, for identification, there's the several tests and assessments that happen, but academically, we're primarily focusing on English language arts and mathematics, from what I saw. So how could we potentially measure achievement in other content areas? I think about the arts, I think about physical education. Is there a way to assess a student's giftedness or their ability to be advanced or whatever in other areas outside of those two?
So I don't know, Dennis, do you want me to take this? We're normally sitting next to each other and we can. Let me start and then Dennis can take it from there. I'm going to begin by saying, that we've been doing this for 4 years. That is ultimately the goal, is to be able to identify every type of giftedness and then service every type of giftedness, right? And so we have created room for that in this policy and regulation. And we've been partnering and trying to, I know as the director of differentiated learning, I'm regularly, how passionate I am about the arts, and especially as you can see in our summer programming and our offerings. But we want to make sure that when we have formal identification protocols for different types of giftedness, we also have the necessary supports for that, right? And so these are some of the areas that we will continue to grow in. That's the truthful answer. We've created room for it in the policy and regulations. I will say we have other ways of identifying kids. We've seen major jumps in the number of ELs, for example, that are identified as talent development learners.
Sure.
And what we did was we were actually looking at the access, so the language growth assessment, and we're seeing students who grew more than we expected. And associated with that, we're able to do professional development for ESOL teachers. We're able to do professional development for schools on how to best support English learners. So what we want to do is add more types of identification when we are able to add the instructional and professional development supports associated with that.
So Laura, to that, I appreciate that. I just have two additional things. I know that we're running over. I have two additional things. The others I'll send. But in the regulations, I believe it's in the guidelines, And I'm looking at number 5, letter C, I, or whatever. Anyway, it talks about the honors courses, right? They're encouraged for the middle grades, but they're expected for the high school grades. Why are we, and it's kind of going to your point, I guess, the one that you just made about making sure that we have the instructional supports and we can offer the professional learning to our staff and our teachers. But from my perspective, I see a lot of gaps in the middle grades, just in general with our system. And I just think that, you know, if we offered more to our middle grade students and families, then we could start to fill some of those gaps. So I'm just curious to know, why are we encouraging honors courses in middle school and not expecting them as we do for high school?
Commissioner McFadden, I can address that question for you. That's because we have some middle schools that are so small, they only have one section of 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. We cannot mandate that they make it an all honors section, because that would be not the appropriate match for some students. We could not simply say that they must offer honors if they only have one section. And we have a number of schools that only have one 6th grade, one 7th grade, one 8th grade. And so we certainly agree 100% that every middle school should be offering honors options to every student that wants to avail themselves of it. But due to the nature of some schools that are just physically so small and they haven't built out a robust middle grade section, we're talking a handful of schools that only have one class of 6th graders. And we can't really rightfully, ethically mandate that all those kids must be in an honor section now.
Sure, I see. But we provide models for differentiation for students that are identified. So that makes sense. So I appreciate that.
Can I add one little thing to that? I think we do have some virtual programs, right? Even prior to the pandemic, we had our virtual algebra program. I do hope, as educators, that what we've been experiencing with this pandemic and this experience with virtual teaching can help to start to address some of that in the future, right? We're in a different space now and our abilities. And so we're not closing the door to anything, but as Dennis said, we couldn't say mandatory because we know there's schools that want to and just couldn't at this point. That's why we put encouraged. It was really hard for us to not say mandatory.
Sure.
It was very hard.
It killed us. It kills us.
It did kill us.
And then finally, the others I'll send. But finally, when we think about the individualized learning plans, right? After a student has been identified, however they've been identified, why is it 3 months, a 3-month window for that ILP to be developed for that student and family? What is the reasoning around 3 months? Is it internal capacity? Like, is it capacity?
Yeah, it's purely a capacity issue. I will say that since the last time we presented to the policy committee, we have been able to fund a Title I position centrally, whose only job is to help schools develop ILPs. But that 3-month window is reflective of just the realities of the fact that there are not people designated at school level to create ILPs, and we've only just recently added a position solely dedicated to ILP support. We obviously encourage people to do it as soon as we've identified. We'd love to tighten the 3-month window, but the 3-month window is reflective of our capacity reality.
Sure. Thanks. Thank you.
Sure, certainly.
Commissioner Lynn, did you want to jump in at all?
No, but I do just want to add to the point that was discussed earlier about, having, virtual learning and the multiple opportunities that, that have been, introduced to the education community. And I think that is definitely very, very important when we talk about that, because that, like she said, that can open up multiple doors for different types of ways that, maybe in the near future, we can, mandate that, we have those honors classes, and then they can just do them virtually. And I think that would just definitely open up a lot of different doors to, one, socially meeting a lot of different other students that are, with, that have the same goals as you or have the same classrooms that are not necessarily within your school,
but they are definitely still in the same school system. And I think that would just definitely open up an abundance of different types of, ideas and, worlds that can be introduced. And definitely also when we talk about other ways that, different high schools and different middle schools, the vocational versus, magnet schools, how they can intertwine as well and have different, ways that can be implemented to other students that they may not have seen in their own school building. But, because we are all intertwined in one school system, we definitely have these multiple entities within these different schools that we can definitely introduce into other schools. And I think that's just a beautiful thing. And, I just wanted to, talk about that. And I'm glad that, us as a district have that mindset already that virtual learning is definitely, has its troubles. But in the end, it's a blessing to us because it, it transformed the educational system as we know it today. And I think that is very key and important because when we talk about the hundreds of years and the decades of how schools has been originally looked at, it's very different to see that we're going to be taking another look at it, and we're looking at it from multiple angles now that we have these multiple angles to come with. So I just wanted to say that was very commendable, and that was very, amazing to hear other people thinking how, I am thinking and other my youth are thinking as well. And I just, beautiful. Definitely,
Yeah.
yes.
We completely hear you. And just so you know, as a quick footnote, we had over 150 students that we were piloting this year before the pandemic to offer remote learning. We had 50 students that were able to do virtual learning with a certified teacher at the other end, and 100 students were able to take elective courses in middle school. We're very cognizant of the need to kind of make a more robust offering available to students in middle schools. The one silver lining I would say from the pandemic is it's forced us to take a giant leap forward. So what was a 150 student pilot this past year is going to be, hopefully, fingers crossed, a much more expansive and robust offering across the district.
Definitely, exactly. And I think that, definitely, it pushed us, but it also kind of, gave us that mindset that we need to get the ball rolling on this, and that's something that we should look at as a, as an option that, definitely we had that 150 pilot, but, now we're looking at it for an entire school district of 80,000 plus students. So, how do we get this, ball rolling faster than we already have it? But I love that we were already in the mindset of having that, discussion and having that virtual opportunity exist even before, the world or even our school system itself had to abide by those rules as well. So, yes.
Agreed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Lynn. So I would just like to add to Dennis and Laura and your team that this, as a process reflection, the way that you presented to us and really listened to our feedback, I would love to see this move forward and us use the committee structures so that then when it's at the large board meetings, we can get, stay at the 10,000 foot level and really move things along to really turn the ship. So thank you for how you handled it process-wise. And then for the community, I'd just like to really highlight, there was a small, quick sentence, but you might not have caught it. And that's that honors and AP courses, there is no entrance criteria to them anymore. Any student who is interested can, based on this policy, participate, which is such a gigantic equity lift that I'm really looking forward to listening to gifted and learning updates in the future that tell the story of students who may not have qualified in the past, but are successful or are matriculating these courses in the future. So thank you so much for all of that work.
Happy to do
Thank
so.
you.
Thank you.
And then, Mr. Gann, I believe that was the last of our presentations, correct?
Yes, correct.
Do we need to adjourn this meeting to start a new meeting, or can we just continue where we are?
We can adjourn.
And then we have to call back in?
It's a different link.
It's a different link. Okay.
Yeah, we can jump over. Yeah.
All right. Do we have any public comment?
No one signed up. No.
Okay, excellent. All right. Then is anyone opposed to adjourning?
Before we adjourn, Dr. James, I do want to just celebrate in committee Commissioner Lynn. This is Commissioner Lynn's final policy committee meeting as a commissioner. He always says, well, he's been saying for the past couple of weeks that he's just going to be on the other side of the table now. So I'm sure that he'll be in future policy committee meetings, but to my knowledge, and Christian, you might want to check me on this, but I think this was the first time that we've had a student commissioner represented on a committee. And I think that Joshua has done a phenomenal job just being present and advocating for his young people. So I just wanted to celebrate and highlight him prior to us adjourning officially with this last meeting for Commissioner Lynn. So that was it.
Yeah, and you are correct, Commissioner McFadden. Commissioner Lynn is the first student that served on committee.
Yes, and I'll just add that while the knowledge is not public yet, I believe the new student commissioner is eager to also serve on the policy committee, so we'll continue to have that student representation.
Excellent, excellent. I think it has definitely been a value add. Thank you very much, Joshua, for your service.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner McFadden, for flagging that, because we are so fortunate to have had Commissioner Lynn for so long on the board. He's just been a huge asset and such a good voice for students. So I'm going to miss you, and you've been an incredible commissioner.
Thank you. I just quickly before we adjourn, I just want to say thank you, Commissioner McFadden, but also, thank you to everyone that's on the policy committee. And I'll definitely also say my official goodbyes at the 28th board meeting. But I definitely just want to, thank you all for the opportunity that we've had. And I just love the, the mindset that the board has had about, the optimism and, what can the student commissioner do and what not do, because I think that's one of my ultimate goals is to end it. And I want to ensure that the student commissioner has full voting rights. And so it was great to hear that, from help from Commissioner McFadden, from help from Mr. Gant, just talking about, diving into COMAR and definitely just seeing what it is that I can do. And as student commissioner, what is, needed from me in the different ways that I can, impact the school. So I definitely just want to say thank you to that as well. And as well as, being on the policy committee, it has taught me a lot of different skills. And I think that, being on the school board and also being on the policy committee, any commissioner that is in this position, definitely one has a big responsibility, but also there's so many opportunities of growth and learning to be had here. So I definitely think that, it's a very amazing thing for me to have. And I just wanted to, add that little snippet in there. But yes, thank you.
Excellent. Any other comments before we adjourn? All right, hearing none. Oh, was there someone? Okay, at 5:44 p.m. we will adjourn and we will go to the other link to reopen the meeting. Thank you, everybody.